IVM.
Rajaraja, Raja Martanda, Raja Gambira, Beta Simha Birudanki, Venkanapati Rajasekhara,
Is it true that the Indian civilization was a peaceful one that never attempted to conquer anyone beyond the Indian subcontinent?
Did Indian and Chinese courts establish diplomatic relations as early as the 10th century?
How did trade transform coastal cities in medieval India?
All this and more on today's episode of the Pragati Podcast.
Hi, this is the Pragati Podcast and we are your hosts, Pavan, Srinath
and Hamsini Hariharan.
Every week on the show, we discuss various topics in economics, politics and international affairs.
This week on the show, we go back to one of the richest and easily overlooked dynasties in India, the Cholas.
The Cholas have a long and glorious history that goes back to the Sangam era, but we are focusing on the medieval Chola dynasty, which stretched across the entire Coromandel coast, traded with merchants around the world, and even managed to conquer areas in Southeast Asia.
To help us jog our memories is our guest on the show today, Devi Yesodharan. She's the author of Empire, a novel of historical fiction based in the 11th century during the peak of Chola power. Hi Devi, welcome to the show.
Hi, it's really nice to be here, Hamsini.
So you worked on the book The Empire, which is the newest and possibly the only work of historical fiction based on the Cholas. So when we think...
In English, yeah.
In English, so, yes. Yeah. So when we think of the 11th century, we know of, Muhammad Ghazni looting North India, but we don't hear of what's happening in South India to an extent. Can you just give us some background to where you'd set your book?
Okay. I agree with you about what you said about our history. It is a little North Indian centric. I remember that when we did study South Indian history, I think it was devoted to around half a page with just a mention of the various kingdoms. Yeah. And that was about it. What I found really interesting about the Cholas was that they were one of the only maritime empires emerging from India. They were very outward looking in terms of their trade as well as their conquests. I think they were the only Indian kingdom that actually went aggressively outside the Indian borders and conquered various territories. And these aspects were very fascinating to me in terms of how they are based in our Indian history and how they affect the culture of the kingdom and the social, forces that are present within the kingdom. So, for example, while the North Indian kingdoms as well as the Vijayanagara Empire that came later were much more feudal, I think the fact that the Cholas were so trade-oriented and had so many foreign settlers in their kingdom really impacted how the social forces played out as well. So, the caste structure was a little more fluid in terms of whether the Shudras were actually considered untouchable, for example, and who were the wealthy and respected communities within the particular kingdom. And the peak of this period was during the periods of Rajaraja Chola, who I think has been talked about fairly in Tamil history and culture because of the epic Ponniyin Selvan, which is set during his particular period and is much beloved by the Tamil people. And as well as his son Rajendra Chola, which is when the empire sort of peaked in terms of the actual territory that it controlled.
Ponniyin Selvan, which Devi mentioned, is a magnum opus, possibly one of the most famous stories in Tamil literature. It's based on historical figures from the Cholan era of the 10th century, particularly Rajaraja Chola. Under his son Rajendra Chola, the empire expanded even more than before.
Under Rajendra Chola, the kingdom encompassed the whole of South India as well as the eastern coast in terms of kings who had pledged their allegiance to the Cholas as well. They captured Sri Lanka, Maldives as well as large parts of Southeast Asia, including modern-day Indonesia, Malaysia, Cambodia as well as southern Thailand. And what I find interesting is the fact that even though this was a king who was very focused on building a naval empire and an empire that was powerful on trade, when he did go and conquer these areas, they did plunder these regions, the Cholas. They had a fairly aggressive army, but they didn't establish the sort of imperialist extractive relationships that you see the British Empire having established several hundred years later, for example. So I found the kingdom as a whole like an extremely interesting study, both socially and culturally as well, besides just the impact they had on our history.
Yeah, I can understand where you're coming from. It sounds so cosmopolitan, right?
Exactly, yeah. I really enjoyed that part of it.
Yeah, and so you were talking about the conquest of the Srivijayas, right? That they went to Southeast Asia. So this would be modern day Sumatra.
Indonesia, yeah. Indonesia, Sumatra.
So, but why would they go to conquer something that's far off? Because something that we say in Indian history is that, the Indian civilization is the only one that's never gone out to conquer any other territory.
Yeah, I think that is definitely a misreading of our history in that we weren't conquerors. There were a couple of interesting forces that were driving Chola decisions to actually conquer outside territories during this time. So one came from the Middle East. This was around the time when the Abbasid Empire in Baghdad was in decline and the Fatimids of Egypt were sort of rising. And the Fatimids were, unlike the Abbasids, a very seafaring sort of empire. And this was around the time in the middle of the 10th century when it was the Gujarat ports that were doing extremely well due to trade with the Arabs and so on. When the Fatimids came to power, however, they shifted their focus to the South Indian ports, the Malabar ports. And that was primarily because they were short on timber for shipbuilding. And these Malabar ports were great exporters of timber. So they used to favor the Malabar ports to trade mainly with them. And so there was a wealth of trade coming from the Middle East. On the East Asia side and the China side, this was around the time that the Song dynasty was on the rise. So the Song emperor, unlike his predecessors, was very focused on naval trade. So the thing that he did in his first year of rule itself was that he sent out 4 missions across South and Southeast Asia, essentially asking kingdoms to come trade with us.
Is this one of the missions where Zhenghi, the Chinese...
That came much later.
Okay.
That was after they were really well established as a powerful naval trading power. This was much earlier on. And once they sent out the 4 missions, essentially the southern and the Southeast Asian kingdoms knew that China was suddenly extremely interested and more open to trade. Srivijayans were in fact the first to respond. They sent back mission in the next year itself. The Cholas under Rajaraja sent a mission in 1015 with a lot of gifts for the Song emperor. So everyone was very eager to do trade with them. And the king in China had established a bureau of licensed trade, which was essentially a state monopoly. They would buy foreign goods and they would sell it inside China. The profit margins were huge. So they had a very strong interest in establishing a strong naval base and trading and so on. And so these two forces were essentially making trade extremely lucrative for kingdoms. And the Cholas were highly aware of that, which is why they wanted to control the naval trade going through the Indian ports. They conquered South India. They had this war with the Cheras. That was a naval fight. The Cheras at that time were considered the preeminent naval power. But Rajaraja fought a war with them in the Kundalai Sarai, which is now the Virinjam port in South India, which is incidentally being developed by the Adanis right now. And so once he conquered the coastline and after Rajendra managed to control the whole of the east coast in Sri Lanka, they essentially had a monopoly over the sea trade, and this brought them a whole lot of wealth. So I think the shifts that were happening in the Middle East and China were driving the importance of naval trade during this time. And Srivijaya started becoming a thorn in Rajendra Chola's skin because one, their position allowed them to tax ships that were traveling to China very easily. If they ever wanted to have a stopover in that region, apparently the duties that the officials levied were extremely high. The other problem was a piracy problem that seemed to be happening around the Srivijaya coast. And Rajendra Chola, I believe, was somewhat suspicious that the pirates were in cahoots with the Srivijaya king, and whatever ships they plundered, some of the wealth would, go to the king as well. So it seemed logical to him to conquer the Srivijayas and establish himself as one of the preeminent naval powers in that region who could trade with China in, more aggressively than anybody else.
Yeah, but even when conquering, they just plundered and then they came back.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
They didn't set up their establishments or institutions or anything like that.
Yeah, which I found quite interesting because they had merchant guilds present in that region. And apparently historians say that the Pallavas who came before them had fortified merchant guilds in East Asia who would, who were a little more extractive in terms of controlling the society and getting taxes and paying it back to the king in South India. But the Cholas didn't seem to have established anything like that. In fact, there is evidence that the Srivijayas revived very quickly after the conquest in 1025 that Rajendra Chola did, because in 1033 the Srivijayans sent another mission to China. with gifts and so on. So they seem to have recovered quite well and been totally fine.
Yeah, I think this is interesting in a foreign policy point of view because there was this famous strategist called Alfred Theo Mahan who in the 1900s said that, if you conquer, if you command your sea lanes of commerce, then that's what will determine your power as a country, as a nation. And this is something that Cholas did long before everyone else. They recognized what sea lanes of commerce were important.
Yeah.
From a foreign policy point of view, this means that the Indians and the Chinese had relations that went back to the 11th century.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the Srivijayans tried very hard to lower the estimation of the Cholas in the Chinese court. They called them the barbarians of the south and so on and so forth to the Chinese court. This has been recorded in some of the Song Chinese documents. But I think despite that, at least during the Rajaraja and Rajendra Chola period, there was some amount of recognition given to them as an independent empire. Although it was very hard, I think, for the Chinese also to establish how big an empire the Cholas actually were, considering the distances and all that involved. But the relationships were definitely there. In fact, related to your point, the relationships became, in fact, strongly naval during this period because I believe around 1023 or so, around a couple of years before the Cholas invaded Srivijaya, the Chinese had asked its trade partner countries to trade more via the Silk Route of the sea rather than Silk Route of the land because the land was harder to guard. They had the fortifications of it were a lot more difficult and so on. So they considered the sea a much more viable option for trade. So the relationships were fairly well established. Although I have to say that partly because of Srivijayan interference and partly because of distance, the Cholas weren't able to make as much headway into the Chinese court in terms of the recognition and respect they got vis-a-vis, other kingdoms closer to it.
Fair enough. Something that also piqued my interest when I was reading Empire is the cosmopolitan nature of all the towns that you mentioned. So which got me wondering too, what does your research say about how cities or towns or just urban centers function during this period?
Okay. There were a few interesting references. I think I had one challenge that I faced was the formal documents, which were the copper plates, versus the informal documents, which are the poetry and the stories and descriptions by travelers and so on of the Chola Empire. So one is the Silapadikaram, for example, has beautiful descriptions of the towns in southern Tamil Nadu during that time. So they mentioned, for example, these large bazaar markets that that is selling everything under the sun, from pearls to spices to interesting foods. So we do know that there were very vibrant street markets around, and there are descriptions from travelers of people of all kinds of skin colors and nationalities wandering around the streets. Because what would essentially happen is that Arab merchants, for example, would arrive to Nagapattinam and have to settle there and wait for their ships to return with their traded goods and so on. So during that time, they would essentially settle there. There were apparently large Roman quarters in Nagapattinam where some Roman merchants had actually settled there permanently, married into the local population and so on. There is one description that I found of a multi-storied building which was filled with Greek merchants who had essentially settled there. And people would talk about the sounds of parties emanating from that building when you pass by the street. So there are some lovely descriptions that give you a sense of what the place was like, fairly lively, fairly dynamic, with a lot of, with a floating population that came in and out kind of thing, which I found extremely interesting. In the case of researching these kind of local towns, I found the poetry very useful because there was a culture of wandering poets during that time, right? Oral poets were very well respected in the Chola courts, and beautiful verses were rewarded with feasts and money and so on. There was one Chola king that reportedly used to roll down a golden ball down the floor of the court whenever the poet recited a poem that he particularly liked. And so these details, the details from the poetry is quite lovely. And you get a sense of a fairly like decentralized administration. The Cholas were not really centralized like the empires that came later. So the villages tend to like govern themselves largely. And when the Chola king did actually, hear cases of crime and, disputes and so on and so forth, largely the punishments were monetary. So even in the cases of murder, very often the king would say, you have to donate enough money to the temple to keep this lamp lit forever. So it was more of a benign administration than an aggressively punitive one. And what was interesting that I found when I read about how these towns and cities were run was that they had a very large bureaucracy, much larger than the kingdoms that came before. And the audit functions of this bureaucracy were very significant. Land records were extremely extensively kept. They were very well documented. There were regular visits by officials to local areas to monitor what people said were crop outputs and so on. And while the landowner gentry grew wealthy and extremely powerful, there was still a balancing act between the state and these particular classes in terms of the taxes actually extracted from them. So you get a sense of largely a well-run administration and a fairly modern city in that sense.
Because you brought up merchants and I'm guessing there were also priests and there were also nobles. So how did the different classes interact and function at that point in time?
Well, I do know that the merchants were fairly senior in the hierarchy simply because I think that the wealth that came through trade tended to outweigh a little bit the wealth that came via agriculture and land. While Kaveri Delta was extremely fertile, the merchants were A, extremely powerful because of the trade income. B, they had very close relationships with the palace, with the kings and so on. So, for example, the warehouses that they used to set up and protect were essentially heavily guarded, and they tended to provide any town that had large numbers of warehouses in its premises. The merchants then had the authority to collect taxes from the people. So that itself gives them a administrative/commerce function, which make them a fairly powerful community in and of themselves. And the fact that they have their own army, which is guarding them and guarding the goods that they're transporting, also makes them powerful as well in the eyes of both the palaces as well as in the eyes of the local people. So I think they were a fairly significant class, and because they used to donate a fair amount of money to the temples as well, that also raised the estimation in the eyes of the Chola society. You do see shifts in terms of who is considered powerful and respectable across different periods. I had paid close attention, for example, in terms of how the women were treated. And it is during the Rajaraja and Rajendra Chola period, which is the wealthiest times, that you see the maximum number of donations by women going into temples. Not just women from the palaces, but women considered as noble women, even wives of blacksmiths, wives of landowners, and so on. The landowners and the cultivators were the wealthiest. And this is why when we were talking about caste, right, the Shudra thing came up, because even though you might be a lower caste, if you were economically wealthy, you still had a position in society that was fairly middling. It was, you weren't necessarily considered untouchable in that sense. So besides the landowners, the professional communities like blacksmiths, ironsmiths, and so on, they were somewhat lower in the hierarchy just because of the income angle to it. There was less money to be earned in these kind of situations. So I would say you would see the merchants, especially the trading merchants with trade relationships established internationally, then probably the landowners and the landowning caste and the cultivating caste, and then these professional sort of guilds like the blacksmiths and so on. That would be the hierarchy of the Cholas from my understanding.
So the entire backdrop of this seems to be provided by trade, because that's what's driving the prosperity of the Cholan Empire. How did it function? Did the Cholan Empire also have licenses like the Song dynasty?
That's an interesting question. I did find descriptions of duties and what do you call these taxes and different amounts of money being levied on these different merchants when they came in with their ships, when they came into a city to trade, when they tried to store their goods in a particular warehouse and so on. But I wasn't able to understand the complete setup of how these particular naval people were essentially taxed and so on, because I've been able to find small details in different essays, but I haven't got a big picture of it as yet. But yes, they did pay a fair amount of coin to the palace treasury for sure. And yeah, so that was a significant amount of revenue for the king. Was that your question?
Yeah. Okay. And also, what did they trade essentially?
Well, there was a fair amount of stuff. Pearls were a big export for the Cholas, especially after they gained control of the Gulf of Munnar, and they got a monopoly over that whole pearl trade. Cotton was a big deal for a lot of the exports. The Chinese, for example, bought cotton for soldier uniforms, white cotton, because most of these soldiers were stationed in very dry, hot conditions. So white cotton imported from India was a much prized commodity, to the extent that you could even use it in lieu of cash. It was considered an accepted form of like barter, yeah. And the particular kind of prints in cotton that evolved during this time, which were imported from Gujarat to the Chola ports and then exported out to Asia, these prints were extremely unusual and therefore extremely prized, especially in Southeast Asia. There was, for example, patterns of interlocking circles, which were worn only by the royalty in Southeast Asia. And there were these other patterns like four-pointed stars, very particular flower motifs. There was a very popular design which involved a god emerging out of a lotus, which became a very popular, fashionable garment among the royalty during that particular period of time, during Rajendra Chola's period. And these designs were unusual enough that they became both their provenance and it was like the designer clothing of today, I guess, right? They're extremely striking, they're distinctive because they're not being reproduced in the local area they're being sold in. And so cotton was a big deal.
Silk, I'm guessing, was a big deal?
Silk, Chinese silk was also very, but yeah, silk, there was, I believe, frankincense, sandalwood, pepper, and the usual
spices.
Yeah, and all that. So, yeah.
Okay, so just turning to the book, so your protagonist, Aramis, is this feisty young Greek girl who's a migrant in a sense, right? She's alien to the situation. Did you place yourself as a migrant in a setting? How did you decide to choose where to place Aramis?
It started out with a detail that I had read that described the use of Greek bodyguards in palaces and around kings during this particular period. The Pandyan king, it was very popular with the Pandyas. There is anecdotal evidence that the Greeks were present in Chola palaces as well, in different professions and so on. And so my idea here was, you have somebody who's a complete outsider in a kingdom that, despite the amount of trade, would otherwise be fairly homogeneous in terms of the palace culture and the local culture and so on. And we do know that, just seeing how it is in the modern day, no matter how so-called integrated societies are, there is a sense of migrants being somewhat out of place, and the politics around migrants, at least right now, is extremely fraught, both in Europe as well as in US, right? The political debates around right now that is happening is, who is a true American, who is a true European, who is a true British, and so much of the politics right now is being driven by that.
This debate is also valid when we talk about who is a true Indian. Sunil Kirnani, who wrote the book The Idea of India, said that there can never be a single idea of an Indian or Indianness. And in the modern world, our roots mix and merge within cultural and social contexts. The advantages of being a migrant, both in a fictional and a real-life context, is that it allows you to figure out how structures work, how institutions work.
Yeah, that's a nice observation, because you're watching alongside her basically in terms of how this culture is like. Yeah. And her homesickness, she's homesick, you're completely alien to this. So you're learning something via her emotions as well as her perspective on things.
Emotions at the end of the day are universal. And that's why maybe we relate to times of the Cholas, and we'd like to think of times of splendor when you're at the peak of your dynasty or your civilization?
Yes, there's a lot of nostalgia in this. That is true, because it was one of the preeminent empires of the time. And you're right about the fact that a lot of it is relatable in terms of the way people talk and the emotions that they express and so on, which is why in the book, at least, I didn't go too much into the hierarchies of the society, because I thought that would break the spell a little bit. Let's instead approach it in the form of interpersonal relationships and, how things play out in that way. Because I think no matter how hierarchical a society is, finally a lot of decisions come down to that for at least, these kind of how things play out in courts, how things play out in palaces and so on.
All right. Okay, I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Devi.
Thank you. It was great fun.
That's it for this episode of the Pragati Podcast. You should check out Devi Yesodharan's book, Empire. And we also have some other readings on the thinkpragati.com page of this podcast episode. If you have any questions or comments, write into podcast@thinkpragati.com and we'll answer them in later episodes. We're also on Twitter as Zeus is Dead and Hamsini H. You can listen to the Pragati Podcast on the IVM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcast fix from. We'll be back next week.
As you can see, we have a podcast listener in his natural habitat. Millions of years of evolution have led him to this point. He's on his way to work, and listening to podcasts makes his miserable day better. He will now head to work and use all his knowledge to communicate with other colleagues and possibly future mates. You can find more of his species on ivmpodcasts.com, your one-stop destination where you can check out all the coolest Indian podcasts. Happy listening.